Right now, in the high deserts and jagged peaks of the eastern Sierra Nevada, the clock is not just ticking, it is accelerating. What scientists saw in the last week's data from the California Volcano Observatory changes everything we thought we knew about the stability of the American West. This is not a slow geological crawl. It is a system-wide awakening occurring in real time. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the risk profile of the Long Valley Caldera, a 15-mile wide volcanic scar that sits directly beneath one of the most vital recreation and infrastructure corridors in the United States. For decades, the seismic catalog for this region recorded approximately 12,000 distinct events, a number that suggested a restless but manageable giant. But that baseline was an illusion. Using advanced artificial intelligence to reprocess just 3 years of raw seismic data, researchers have expanded that catalog from 12,000 to more than 54,000 events. That is 4.5 times more seismic activity than previously documented, a hidden swarm of microfractures and fluid movements that were invisible to traditional monitoring. The scale of the physical deformation is even more staggering. Since 2005, the ground above the central resurgent dome has risen 1.4 meters, that is 4 feet and 7 inches, without stopping for 18 consecutive years. Imagine the sheer volume of pressure required to lift thousands of megatons of crustal rock nearly 5 feet into the air. This week, the USGS monitoring network recorded a new all-time high in carbon dioxide emissions at the Horseshoe Lake killing fields, and the director of the California Volcano Observatory has publicly stated that raising the alert level to orange, watch, is something she considers possible in the near future. We are talking about a caldera formed by two catastrophic eruptions 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, located directly adjacent to the town of Mammoth Lakes and the critical Owens Valley water system. Its last significant activity was only a few centuries ago, when volcanic domes rose from the earth in a matter of weeks. Since 2005, the system has been in a documented and escalating period of unrest, and as of April 2026, the scientists themselves are no longer using cautious diplomatic language. In July 2025, Dr. Marcus Sterling, a lead official at the USGS, stood before the Congressional Subcommittee on Natural Resources and Emergency Preparedness and called the Long Valley situation a national emergency, not a speculative headline. This was a formal statement to the United States government. He disclosed a statistic that should haunt every resident of the Eastern Sierra. In the South Moat region, scientific models now indicate a 40 to 50% probability that an eruptive vent capable of generating pyroclastic flows could open. 40 to 50%. This isn't a 1 in a million scenario. It is a coin flip. The earthquakes that used to be small and scattered have grown in both intensity and frequency, and the rock beneath the surface is reaching its breaking point. The data is clear. The giant is not just snoring, it is breathing, and the crust is starting to crack. The chronology of this crisis is no longer measured in centuries, but in hours. At 4:32 a.m. on April 7, 2026, the silence of the Eastern Sierra was shattered by a magnitude 3.3 earthquake centered at a depth of just 2.4 kilometers, roughly 1.5 miles, beneath the southwestern edge of the resurgent dome. It woke residents across Mammoth Lakes and Crowley Lake, rattling the foundations of structures already stressed by decades of slow-motion ground deformation. But that was only the beginning. Less than 36 hours later, at 4:48 p.m. today, April 8, 2026, a magnitude 3.4 event struck at a depth of 1 kilometer, approximately 0.6 miles. The epicenter was located directly beneath the Hot Creek geological site. This depth is critical. At 1 kilometer, we are seeing seismic failure within the shallowest, most brittle layer of the American crust, a zone that has been structurally compromised by millennia of thermal stress and pressure. The technical data behind these numbers reveals a system that is fundamentally changing state. For years, The prevailing scientific consensus suggested that the uplift in the Long Valley Caldera was largely driven by hydrothermal fluids, boiling water and steam trapped beneath the surface. However, a landmark study published in late 2024 in Earth and Planetary Science Letters forced a total reassessment of the plumbing system. By analyzing the isotopic signatures of gases and the specific frequencies of seismic waves, researchers confirmed that episodic injections of magma have been entering both shallow and deep reservoirs beneath the caldera's resurgent zone since approximately 2019. This means we are not just dealing with a hot spring problem. Magma is actively moving in the deep plumbing, and the rock above it is responding. In April 2026, the USGS California Volcano Observatory's weekly bulletin confirmed that ground inflation has hit a peak rate of 3 cm per month in localized sectors. GNSS stations, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, are recording horizontal offsets of 12 cm, indicating that the ground is not just rising, it is being pushed outward, stretching the crust like a balloon reaching its limit. The most alarming development, however, came from the detection of very long-period VLP seismic signals. Published in Communications, Earth and Environment in July 2025, these signals were located at a depth of 3.6 kilometers. In the world of volcanology, VLPs are the smoking gun of fluid movement. They indicate a fracture system has formed, creating a direct communication pathway between the deep magma inflation source and the fumaroles at the surface. For the first time, instruments are tracing the actual route that pressurized fluids and gases are taking as they migrate toward the surface. Beneath the surface of this American landscape sits a layer of damaged rock between 2.5 and 3 kilometers deep. Think of this as a geological scar. This zone has been weakened by repeated magma intrusions over the last 700,000 years, losing its structural integrity. When the USGS reports that the rock is fracturing, they are describing the failure of this compromised layer. As superheated fluids from the deep magma source hit this fractured zone, the pressure exceeds the rock's strength, triggering the swarms that AI has now revealed to be 4.5 times more frequent than we once believed. The infrastructure vulnerability is extreme. US Route 395, the primary north-south artery for the Eastern Sierra and a critical supply line for the entire region, runs directly through the caldera. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, which provides a significant portion of the water for millions of people, hundreds of miles to the south, is physically tied to the stability of this ground. A significant shift in the caldera floor could sever these lifelines in an instant. Scientists are no longer asking if the rock will fail, but how much more pressure it can sustain before the system moves from internal fracturing to an external release. The carbon dioxide measurements at the Horseshoe Lake killing fields have hit an all-time record this week, a geochemical warning that the deep system is venting at a rate never before seen in the instrumental era. The clock is not just ticking, the gears are beginning to grind. To understand the sheer magnitude of the threat we are facing in the Eastern Sierra, we must look back at the geological blueprint of the American West. The Long Valley Caldera is not merely a mountain. It is a 200 square mile collapse feature that represents one of the most violent events in Earth's history. 760,000 years ago, the Bishop Tuff eruption ejected over 150 cubic miles of magma in a matter of days, a volume that would bury the entire city of Los Angeles under a layer of ash 1,500 feet thick. While a supereruption of that scale is considered a low probability event today, the cyclicity of the system tells a much more immediate and terrifying story. The Long Valley system has a documented history of burst activity, where centuries of silence are shattered by decades of intense, accelerating unrest. Scientists at the USGS and the California Volcano Observatory point to the 1980 Mammoth Lakes earthquake swarm as the beginning of the current cycle. In May of that year, just days after the cataclysmic eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington, The Long Valley Caldera was rocked by 4 magnitude 6.0 earthquakes in just 48 hours. That event signaled a fundamental shift in the regional stress field, likely triggered by the injection of new magma into the roots of the system. Since then, the caldera has been breathing, inflating and deflating, but the 1.4-meter uplift recorded since 2005 suggests we have moved beyond simple breathing into a phase of permanent structural failure. The historical parallel that volcanologists are now studying with renewed urgency isn't just the ancient Bishop Tuff, but the 1538 eruption of Monte Nuovo in a similar caldera environment. Relocating that scenario to the US context, scientists are looking at the Mono Inyo craters chain, which stretches from Mammoth Mountain northward to Mono Lake. This chain has produced small but violent eruptions every few hundred years, with the most recent occurring only 650 years ago at Panum Crater. The geological record shows that these eruptions often begin with little warning, rising from the ground in 48 to 72 hours, driven by the same fracture and fill mechanism we are seeing in the 2026 data. The system is being driven by a complex tectonic coupling that is unique to the United States. The Long Valley Caldera sits at the intersection of the Sierra Nevada block and the Walker Lane deformation zone. This is a region where the strike-slip energy of the San Andreas fault system to the south meets the extensional pooling of the Great Basin. The crust here is literally being torn apart at a rate of several millimeters per year. This tectonic tearing creates a vertical highway for magma. When you combine this regional stretching with the 54,000 micro-earthquakes detected by AI in the last 3 years, the picture becomes clear. The crustal lid over the magma reservoir is no longer a solid barrier. It is a shattered mosaic of rock held together only by the weight of the mountains above it. USGS forecast models presented to the California Office of Emergency Services, CalOES, now incorporate the failed layer theory. This study, published in Science Journal, indicates that the rock between 1.5 and 2 miles deep has reached its yield point. Statistics show that when a system reaches this level of fracture density, the probability of a phreatic or steam-driven explosion increases exponentially. These are the same types of blue sky disasters seen at other restless calderas, where superheated groundwater flashes to steam instantly, shedding the ground into a lethal spray of rock and boiling mud. The 40 to 50% probability of a new vent opening in the south mode is a direct calculation of this structural fatigue. We are looking at a system where the internal pressure of the magma and gases is finally overcoming the tensile strength of the California crust. The twist in the science came in early 2026, when USGS integrated their GNSS data with satellite interferometric synthetic aperture radar INSAR. The data showed that the uplift is no longer symmetrical. The ground is tilting. This tilt suggests that the pressure source is migrating laterally, moving from the center of the uninhabited resurgent dome toward the residential and commercial heart of Mammoth Lakes. If the magma is seeking a new path, the historical frequency of the Mono Inyo chain suggests that when it finds a weakness, the transition from unrest to eruption will not be measured in years, but in days. The United States has not dealt with a caldera-scale emergency in modern history, and the statistical models suggest our window of managed uncertainty is closing. The scientific data provides the skeleton of this crisis, but the human dimension is where the true terror of the Long Valley Caldera resides. For Sarah Chen, a coordinator with the Mona County Office of Emergency Management, the April 2026 seismic events were not just points on a graph. They were the sound of structural failure. When the magnitude 3.4 earthquake struck at 4:48 p.m. on April 8th, she was inside the Mammoth Lakes Library. She described the sensation not as a shake, but as a violent vertical jolt, the unmistakable signature of a shallow focus event directly beneath the town's feet. This is the reality for the approximately 8,000 permanent residents of Mammoth Lakes, and the tens of thousands of tourists who flock to the region. They are living on a lid that is beginning to crack. The managed uncertainty that USGS officials discuss in briefings takes a different form on the streets of Mammoth. David Hack-Miller, a local business owner who has operated a mountaineering shop on Main Street for 30 years, represents a documented and growing crisis within the caldera: the refusal of structural inspections. Following the magnitude 4.6 event in 2025, the largest in the instrumental history of the caldera, FEMA and Cal OES offered state-funded safety assessments for residential and commercial buildings. Yet, a significant portion of the population has refused. The fear is not just the volcano, it is displacement. In a town where real estate is the lifeblood of the economy, a red-tagged building is a death sentence for a family's net worth. If they tell me my foundation is compromised by the swarms, Miller stated in a recent local town hall, I'm not just losing a shop, I'm losing my life's work. So we stop looking at the cracks. This human refusal to acknowledge the geological reality creates a nightmare scenario for rescuers. If a larger event occurs, they will be entering a labyrinth of already weakened structures that were never officially documented as hazardous. The logistics of an evacuation in the Eastern Sierra are a harrowing exercise in geographic bottlenecks. US Route 395 is the only high-capacity artery. To the west sits the impenetrable wall of the High Sierra. To the east, the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Great Basin. If a volcanic alert level moves to red, the plan involves moving over 30,000 people down the Sherwin Grade toward Bishop, a 2,000-foot descent on a highway that crosses multiple fault lines and areas prone to massive rock slides. In April 2026, a Department of Transportation Caltrans report noted that the 395 is already showing unexplained vertical displacement near the Tom's Place turnoff, likely a result of the 1.4-meter regional uplift. This means the primary escape route is itself being deformed by the very system people would be fleeing. The ecological and invisible threats are equally alarming. At Horseshoe Lake, the USGS has monitored a tree-kill zone for decades, where high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the soil suffocate the roots of the forest. In the last week of April 2026, the CO2 flux reached a new atmospheric record. For Elena Rodriguez, a USGS field technician, the data is a personal warning. She recalls an incident during the 2025 swarm, when her handheld sensor went into a high-level alarm while she was simply walking her dog near the lake's basin. The ground is exhaling, she noted in a field log. It's not just the earthquakes you feel, it's the air you breathe in the low-lying areas. This gas represents the deep magma reservoir, degassing, a process that suggests the magma is moving high enough into the plumbing system for pressure to drop and gases to escape. The economic implications are staggering, with current estimates placing the value of at-risk infrastructure and property in the Mono Basin at over $15 billion. But the cost isn't just in buildings. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, LADWP, maintains a massive network of conduits and reservoirs in the caldera. A hydrothermal explosion or a significant fault offset could contaminate or sever the water supply for millions of Southern Californians. The power grid, managed by Southern California Edison, relies on high-voltage lines that span the caldera's most active seismic zones. During the April 7th quake, a substation near Crowley Lake suffered a transformer failure, plunging 4,000 homes into darkness for 12 hours. It was a minor preview of the systemic collapse that would follow a true magmatic event. The stories of those on the front lines, like Dr. Rodriguez and Sarah Chen, highlight a chilling scientific consensus. The system is no longer waiting for a trigger. The trigger is the cumulative fatigue of the rock itself. As the 54,000 earthquakes detected by AI continue to shred the brittle crust, the damaged layer identified in nature communications, is becoming a fluid field honeycomb. Each magnitude 3.0 quake is another stitch popping in a pressurized suit. For the people of the Eastern Sierra, the sound of the next earthquake isn't just a noise. It is the sound of the American crust reaching its breaking point. As we look toward the remainder of 2026 and into 2027, the trajectory of the Long Valley Caldera is no longer a matter of academic debate, but of national security. The progression of the data, from the 4.5-fold increase in seismic detections to the unprecedented 1.4-meter ground deformation, points toward a system that is decoupling from its historical baseline. If the current rate of inflation and seismic energy release continues, the USGS California Volcano Observatory will be forced to transition from yellow/advisory to orange/watch, a move that would trigger the largest mobilization of federal resources for a volcanic hazard in US history. The vulnerability of the American West is not localized to a single mountain town. It is a systemic fragility that spans the entire continent. The most immediate risk for the next 12 to 24 months is the spreading risk of structural failure along the Walker Lane deformation zone. Scientific models suggest that as the resurgent dome continues to rise at 3 centimeters per month, the tectonic stress is being transferred to secondary fault systems. This could trigger coupled seismic events, earthquakes on the nearby Hilton Creek or Mono Lake faults, that, while technically tectonic, are being driven by magmatic pressure. For the United States, this means the threat is not just a volcanic vent, but a cascading failure of the regional infrastructure. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, which crosses several of these high-risk zones, is particularly vulnerable. A major offset could sever the water supply for millions, creating a humanitarian crisis in Southern California long before a single grain of ash is ever erupted. The logistics of the national emergency declared by Dr. Sterling before Congress involve the protection of critical American corridors. Interstate 80 to the north and the high-voltage transmission lines of the Intermountain Power Project are at risk from regional ground deformation. If a medium-scale eruption were to occur, comparable to the events that formed the Inyo craters 650 years ago, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, would be forced to close the primary air corridors connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles to the rest of the country. Volcanic ash, even in small quantities, is a localized death sentence for jet engines. A single week of sustained activity at Long Valley could paralyze the Pacific Southwest's economy, with costs exceeding $2 billion per day in lost trade, grounded flights, and supply chain disruptions. Looking further ahead, we must confront the 40 to 50% probability of a vent opening in the South Moat area. This is the documented scenario presented to lawmakers. A phreatic or magmatic eruption in this specific sector would produce pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and rock moving at 100 miles per hour that would incinerate everything in the immediate 5 to 10 mile radius. While the chances of a caldera-wide super-eruption remain low in our lifetime, the geological record shows that even small events in this system have regional consequences. The American breadbasket in the Great Plains sits directly downwind. According to NOAA's ash dispersal models, a moderate eruption would deposit a layer of glass-rich ash across Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Nebraska, potentially devastating U.S. agricultural output for multiple growing seasons. The final scientific truth is that we are witnessing the inevitable result of a massive magmatic system interacting with a thinning, fracturing crust. The damaged layer of rock at 2.5 kilometers is no longer a barrier, it is a conduit. The VLP signals detected in late 2025 and early 2026 confirm that the pathway for magma and gas is established. The communication between the deep reservoir and the surface is open. As we move into 2027, the focus of the USGS and FEMA will shift from monitoring to mitigation. But the geology is indifferent to our preparations. The Long Valley Caldera has its own timeline, dictated by the relentless movement of the North American plate and the rising pressure of 150 cubic miles of potential energy beneath our feet. There is no political solution for a fracturing crust. There is no negotiation with a caldera that has decided to wake up. We are entering a period of managed instability, where the only responsible course is to follow the data, respect the sensors, and acknowledge that the American landscape is a living, breathing, and occasionally violent entity. I will continue to track the weekly bulletins from the California Volcano Observatory. This is the most monitored, most scientifically significant